Have you ever wanted to make a game, but you weren't quite sure exactly what all the game was going to need or where to start? Well, let's take a look at a tool that might help you a little bit with that today. Hello, and thank you all for joining us again here today on Hastings County for another TTRPG Talk. This video series takes a look at tabletop role-playing games and related materials, makes suggestions for some of your own games, and explores the various options that exist out there for world building and game design. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a new little tool that I have recently been developing, in part based on some of the ways that I think about game design or project design in general, but might also be useful for some of y'all. So I figured I might as well actually create a somewhat attractive and useful tool for people to potentially use for doing this. So let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at that real quick. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our new tool. So this is the Theory of Game, an adapted logic model for creating new games. This is intended basically so that for you to kind of think through the actual game creation process in a sort of flow, very similar to what people do whenever they are using logic models or theories of change to come up with not necessarily a project, but a program, a whole set of projects with the intention of creating a long-term impact, which is actually that column right there. So again, this comes from the project design and stuff like that. But of course, you can use those basic structures and mechanics, those basic mechanics. I have game in the brain. Those basic structures and elements to kind of create your own game, right? So basically the way that you would utilize this is at the top here we have our end goal. The end goal, basically, it would be this is the sort of very basic, bare bones, maybe one sentence or less description of what type or feeling of a final product of a game you want. Is this an adaptation of something? Is this very basic bare bones description of like a type of game or setting? So maybe this is an OSR dungeon delver. Your whatever inspiration or the basic feeling and stuff that goes here, just so you can keep that in mind as you're running through the whole system. Now, again, I describe this as the end goal, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the end goal. In that, like, once you get to the end over here, as you travel across, this doesn't have to actually be the end, right? You could end up with something that looks completely different, and that's fine. What's important is that as a result of going through this whole process from one end to the next, you end up with a better product in the end, because you've figured out all the pieces that you need, and you know all the pieces that what the results and impacts of those pieces working together are going to be before you even sit down and write the game. Or at the very least, you have a theory of how it might work. Now, obviously, is it going to work that way? There's only one way to find out. So, real quick, I'll go ahead and run you through. Again, we got to go from one side to the other. So I'm going to run you through each of these columns real quick before we start doing a slightly practical example. On the far left over there, we have our needs. Basically, here we would be describing in big strokes the basic things that we feel that this game needs. So, again, if we're doing a political strategy game, we probably need a pretty robust social system, right? If we're doing an OSR dungeon delver, we're going to need a pretty robust combat system. Here we have our inputs. These are going to be the actual types of mechanical systems and the actual setting themes that we really need to have in order to fulfill the needs that we had here, right? I mentioned the dungeon delver game. Well, in order to have a dungeon delver game, we need to have dungeons. What do we need to have a dungeon? Some sort of tool to create the dungeons, right? So that would be an example. In our middle column here, we have our activities. These would be the more nitty-gritty elements, right? What specific elements, whether that's fiction, mechanical elements, tools, are we going to need in order to build out the themes and systems to create the game itself? Again, dungeons. Here we have dungeons. Here we have a dungeon generation system. Here would be the specifics of the dungeon generation system, right? Are we going to rely on dice and tables? Are we going to rely on like a Carta system style of cards, referencing with a reference guide? Are we going to be looking at something along the lines of what like Stoneburner has, where you have different sized dice and you just throw them on the table, and where they land, that's where things pop up, and the value and the size of the dice tell you information about what's there, that kind of stuff. Now, so we now have the specific different elements that are coming together to create our game. What are the results? Here we'll go the actual outcome of the specific mechanics and fictional elements being used, whether that's independently or together. How does the player feel? Here's the important part. In the moment of using them, right? These are the immediate results. So again, and let's say I decided to go with rolling dice on tables for the dungeon creation. How does the player feel when they do that, right? You roll as you go, so we have building tension as the player is developing it, because they don't know what's going to happen until they open the door, right? So it's not pre-generated or stuff like that. We're literally generating as we go along. You could have something similar if you decided to go with like the Carta system card flip. Okay, well, I mean, there's that tension of the card flip, but then you got to go and you got to flip through the book, right? Some people might not necessarily enjoy that. It might break them out of the immersion a bit more than if you were rolling on tables. That might also break immersion for some people a bit more. There's obviously there's trade-offs. Finally, we come to our last element here, the impact. How does the player feel in the end, right? What is the impact of the entire experience on the player or players at the table at the end of the session? So here we would be describing how different activities and results would filter out into the wider moment, right? Maybe with that Carta system, card system, a player might get a little frustrated as they're flipping through the book in order to find the specific things, but the mounting elements of the story and the visual display of the cards would have a greater impact than if they were having to kind of draw it out themselves using dice and rolling tables, especially if the players recalls back to exactly what those cards were and what they meant and stuff like that. Here's the final question. Now that once we have worked our way all the way through and we've gotten all of our things, we come to our final question. Did we accomplish our end goal? Maybe we did. Maybe we didn't. Maybe we strayed a bit from our original vision, but that's fine. If we didn't achieve the end goal, right, are we satisfied with it anyway? Let's say we set off with the idea of creating some sort of mystery story, but we ended up with some sort of political thriller instead. Well, I mean, as long as you're okay with that, and that's fine. That is the basics of theory of game and how you kind of go through the process from one end to the other. Now, we're going to do a practical example. One game that I've been intending to create for a while is a game where you are playing a traveling trader. This is sort of based on the basic plot line and storyline of setting of Spice and Wolf, for those of you who are familiar with it. If you're not, Spice and Wolf is a series of Japanese light novels that then were adapted into anime that are intended to describe a traveling merchant, a peddler named Lawrence, who ends up becoming the companion to a, uh, an ancient pagan deity named Horo, who is like a wolf spirit of harvest. And basically, they are traveling and trading through this world that is very loosely based off of sort of like a middle to late medieval Germany, probably. Definitely Holy Roman Empire, where you have a bunch of little city states and stuff like that, and multiple different currencies and all kinds of things going on. So there's a lot of discussion of what trade would have been like in the Middle Ages, and the impact of the church on things, and guilds and economic trade, and rules about like who's allowed to trade, who's allowed to do what sorts of trades where, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of that in it. So I want to create a game that kind of has that similar feel, a peddler game. So it's based on Spice and Wolf. It's based on Spice and Wolf, but I'm intending on also giving it a bit, not necessarily like a super amount of historical realism, but a bit more historical realism than exists in Spice and Wolf. I don't know if I necessarily want to have a huge amount of fantasy in it. I mean, not that Spice and Wolf is necessarily super fantasy outside of, like, you know, the magic of the gods. It's more like magical realism, to be perfectly honest. But rather more like what you might expect in like the series of games built around the world of Harn, if you're familiar with that. From back in the 80s. Anyway, so again, as we're going through, what are some things that this peddler game would need? Well, obviously, we need some sort of economic system because we have to trade, right? So we need let's replace this for economic system. Instead, we need trade and money of some kind, right? We need some sort of trade and money. Okay, what else is this game going to need? We need to be able to travel. In order to really embrace some of the elements that they introduced in Spice and Wolf, there's also some political stuff. So obviously we need some a robust social. We need some sort of robust social system. What we probably don't want is a strong combat system. We do need a combat system of some sort, but we don't necessarily need to have like a super in-depth one. So we can go with a simplified combat system. Now, we're going to pick one of these and move on to our inputs, okay? And actually, to do that, I'm going to take advantage of merging cells to do that, because we're going to take a look at two things that we might be able to put together to create sort of the things we need for trade and for money. Well, the first thing we obviously need is some sort of reactive economic system. And by that, I mean we need a system that needs to be able to change itself slowly over the course of time, so that is somewhat reactive to what's going on in the world outside of the player's control, but also I want it to be able to react at least a little bit to the player themselves. Basically, I don't want the player to find a spot of like high arbitrage and just be able to run back and forth over and over and over and over and over and over and over again just to make a whole lot of money. Because A, that's not very interesting play-wise, and B, that's not very realistic either. So we need some sort of reactive system that would be able to basically prevent players from gaming. It's a game. Of course they're gaming. Anyway, from basically rigging the system or taking advantage of exploiting the system. We don't want them to exploit the system in that way. The second thing that our trade and money system needs is we need some sort of means of controlling inventory. Because obviously, if I'm traveling around in a wagon, it doesn't make sense that I'd be able to carry tons and tons and tons of stuff, because obviously my horse can only pull so much, or ox or oxen or whatever, right? They can only pull so much. My wagon can only hold so much. And if I put so much in my wagon, it's just going to break anyway. So I think we definitely need some form of inventory control. Now we come to our activities. What are the specific ways I'm going to actually, do these things? Well, I have some ideas on places to look for reactive economic systems and come up with some basic ideas. So I mentioned Harn, right? Harn World, or Harn Master is the actual name of the game. Harn World is just basically a description of the world. That might be a good place to look for some economic system-y stuff. It might be too intense to really structure and maintain, and it might not be super reactive, but it's a good place to start. Because again, it is a sort of it's technically fantasy, but really low fiction fantasy sort of a thing. Another place where it might be good to look would be a game that relatively recently came out called Worlds Within. It is Worlds Within, right? Yeah. Which does have some elements similar to this. There's some Traveler adaptations that have some elements of trade and stuff that might be interesting to look at and potentially incorporate. I'll have to definitely shop around on this one. I don't have a basic idea yet. So again, this is something you could do. You could brainstorm, write down some basic ideas, go back, look at them later, come back, revise, delete, remove, change. This is not like a sit down. This is a good tool to sit down and do the rough draft all at once, or at least go at least 2 activities, and then keep fleshing it out as you, and obviously make changes as you go. Inventory control. What is a way we could do inventory control? Well, I feel that doing numbers might not necessarily be the best way to do it. Yes, it's true. A lot of people playing this game are probably going to be in for the numbers, especially since this is an economic game based on economics and trade. However, I would also like to at least develop certain elements of this game to make it more appealing to people who are not necessarily going into it for fantasy spreadsheets and instead wants to actually enjoy the more social and political and travel aspects of being a traveling trader. And so I want to simplify some of these elements, some of these inventory control elements. So I think a good way to potentially do that would be to adapt, I believe it's from Mouse Ritter. But there is a sort of, and this has been in some computer games too. Like I think maybe Diablo did it. There's a couple other ones that have done it, where it's like a Tetris style, where basically your inventory, your backpack, like your wagon, is a box, and then the stuff that you carry and you use in things fill up spaces inside the box. And each of them has like a shape that has to fit inside the big box. And if it's too big to fit, or if it won't fit with everything else in there, you got to move things around and twist them and it's so it provides I feel it provides an interesting means of storing stuff without having to like be super visual. I meant the opposite of what I just said. It provides a more visually satisfying means and physically manipulative way of doing that inventory for those items in the game without having to rely on, again, like I said, fantasy spreadsheets, not having to do a ton of number control and stuff like that. Obviously, you could swap this out for something else if you like the numbers, but, lots of people don't. So, and I'm thinking of actually probably simplifying the actual like money system too, because, trade at the time, you would often have like trade in kind, or, 5 or 6 different forms of currency all being used at the same time, and not all coins of the same type were actually the same value because of debasing or snipping or all kinds of weird stuff you could do to coins. So yeah. So again, results. Let's just keep going with the inventory system. So what would the results of this be? Again, more intuitive than numbers. Another possible result of using the Tetris system is that it provides a stimulating puzzle element, and it's visually easier to keep track of. Okay. And then finally, the impact at the end. Now, I'm not going to bother filling out the impact for this because it's kind of hard to get a feel for what the impact of the inventory system would be without really understanding the other systems that would be interacting with it, especially like the actual trade and travel elements. So I'm just going to leave that blank for now. But you get the basic idea. Basically, you work your way across, slowly filling in your things. So you might be able to fill your needs and inputs right away, have to do some investigation or pondering or brainstorming for your activities. Once you get those filled in, you can go into your results, consider all the results together and sort of like what would be the long-term impact of the game. And if it's something that you think would work, then there you go. You got your game. So that was just a basic kind of walkthrough first of what the tool is, and then providing an example, and I guess also telling you a little bit about a project I'm hopefully coming out with in the near future. Yay, you get more than one. So yeah, this is a pretty simple tool. I kind of just drew this up on just in Google Sheets. Obviously, like I mentioned, you can use different cell colorations or combining and merging and breaking apart cells to kind of create your chains going across. If you have lots of moving pieces in your game because it's a really complicated game, or just you prefer spreading things out more and you like the post-it notes and string and arrows sort of elements of it, I could definitely see instead using like a flowchart or a diagramming software to do this instead, or if you're not just doing it on paper. So for example, like draw.io, from what I understand, is a free sort of flowchart style software that you could use. If you have access to I would have suggested Jamboard, but unfortunately Jamboard's going away soon. But something along those lines of like a Jamboard or a Mural or something like that might work. Muleboard, whatever works best for you in order to visualize it. But just use these 5 buckets to kind of help visualize and kind of conceptualize what all this is going to look like before you actually really sit down and kind of make it. Partly to, and also this is obviously a very useful element to do if you're working with other people and not creating a game by yourself, because then everybody gets a chance to input and make suggestions for certain elements, working together to create the different elements and stuff. But also then you can go ahead and start assigning people elements that either they're going to be researching or going ahead and writing or stuff from the very beginning. Even if it's just to create a slightly more organized rough draft that ends up being a bit closer to the original product than you might have otherwise. So that was the theory of game. A link to this will be found down below. I will do a sort of view only link that you can then make copies of it yourself on Google Sheets. And then so it'll just link to like a directly to a Google Google Sheets file, basically. But then when I get a chance, I will also go ahead and create, I guess, an itch page for this. I can't believe I just said that. I'm intentionally creating itch pages for things that aren't games. Anyway, I'll probably create an itch page for this, and then once that's up, I'll also I'll replace the link for the Google Sheets, because it'll just be attaching to the same file. So you'll have to hop through an extra layer. Sorry, but it'll probably be a little while until I get a chance to put that together, because life is busy. But yeah, thank you all for joining us again here today on Hessens County for another TTRPG talk. I hope this tool it turns out to be at least useful for some of you. Even if it's just to think about just a new approach on thinking how to design a game. Don't forget to rate your own itch purchases, or this file if I get it up on itch in a reasonable amount of time. And have a good zone.